So just for the record, the Councilmember Vinker, who is the third member of the Rail Committee, was not able to make this meeting, and so Mayor Koo is substituting, and we have full contingency of council members. And this is our first meeting of the year for the Rail Committee and of this newly constituted group. And so the focus of the meeting today will be on discussion of the 2022 to 2023 work plan. But before doing so, do we have on the agenda to have public comment for items that are not otherwise agendized? And do we have any speakers who wish to speak to that?
Does look like we have a hand raised, Bob Leanne.
Great. Just one moment.
Sorry.
No problem. We'll have.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
There we are. Go right ahead.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Bob, and I have a public comment. I live right at 101 Alma Street, which is right next to the Caltrain rail crossing at Alma and Palo Alto Avenue. And I just wanted to share and spend a few minutes to share about the extremely loud honking and horn blasting that really occurs every time the Caltrain crosses the intersection. This happens frequently, several times within every given hour, from early in the morning to late towards midnight. The honking noise really varies by the train conductor. Sometimes they like to go in short sequential bursts, like burr, burr, burr. Oftentimes it's really much longer, burr, burr, even after the head of the train has passed the intersection. There are a few conductors who simply honk a few times before the train passes at the intersection. So as you can imagine, this creates a really unhealthy and disturbing environment to live in. Whether it's taking a conference call at home, trying to unwind or relax, or spend time with family and friends, this continuous honking ultimately affects the mental health and well-being of me and those that live around me. I do understand that the honking is for safety purposes, but I personally feel that there are already enough safety measures in place to know that a train is coming. And I believe that trying to create a healthier and peaceful environment to support the wellness of the residents in the area is just as critical. So that's just my short comment. I want to thank the council and all those that have already been involved in trying to find a solution to this matter. I hope that together we can continue to make downtown Palo Alto and that entire area a beautiful place to live, work, and prosper as a community. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And before proceeding to Penny Elson, our next speaker, I just want you to be aware that under the primary item tonight or this afternoon is under our work plan, item F is a discussion or about agendizing the work on quiet zones, specifically with the first focus on Palo Alto Avenue. So you may be interested in that later. And our next speaker is Penny Elson. Welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I attended Monday night's meeting regarding the city's work plan. And I noted that today's work plan document, the Rail Committee 2022-23 work plan, which is attachment A, this document points to a number of other documents staff intends to use to inform the grade separation planning process, including the bicycle pedestrian transportation plan. Though no consultant for the BPTP has been selected yet, and the Monday night meeting put the contract approval in second quarter of 2023. So my question is, what are the project timelines for grade separation planning and the BPTP update? And can staff please explain specifically how the project timelines for these two projects will be aligned to enable the BPTP to inform the grade separation process. And I'm going to go offline. I hope that question will be asked of staff today, and I hope we can get a response, if not today, at a future meeting. Thanks so very much for hearing my comments.
Thank you. And our final speaker is Laura Gronka. Welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me and doing the great work that you do. I really appreciate it. Can you hear me okay? Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thank you. I just wanted to offer a couple of comments. I live on Churchill between Alma and Emerson, and I have really appreciated the past rail committees last year. And I wanted to just echo a couple of things that I heard. One, with regards to the quiet zones, I really appreciate you doing the quiet zone study. I think it's with Caltrain running at a schedule that's more packed than they've ever in their entire history. The train whistle is definitely a force to be reckoned with for people living and also crossing. And so if it's a full quiet zone, partial quiet zone, I was pretty impressed with the city of San Jose, which did a partial quiet zone during nighttime hours, around 23 intersections within just a couple of years when a train changed the schedule. So look forward to that. Appreciate it. The other thing that I just wanted to bring up also was with regards to the Churchill crossing. And looking at the partial underpass options, it's pretty clear that it's going to be challenging to get a pedestrian underpass in the vicinity of Kellogg or Churchill with the partial underpass option. And I just wanted to underscore the importance of pedestrians and cyclists at that intersection, both for the neighborhood community feel and for the high school. I know there's a lot of discussion around around closing Churchill to vehicular traffic, but essentially that partial underpass could potentially close Churchill to pedestrian and cyclist traffic, which is to me significantly more unfortunate because those are the people where you're inconveniencing more when you have to go out of your way because it takes significantly longer. So to that end, I thought it would be helpful. I know that we're exploring the partial underpass options with the closure as a backup is just to kind of put some, just for the cost, money, time going into this partial underpass exploration, just a request to put in sort of some success criteria and a time-bound nature of this such that we can hopefully come to a decision sooner rather than later on that crossing. But again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. So that concludes our public comments on unagendized items. And so I think we can now move on to the verbal updates from staff on interagency activities. Mr. Kami, or did you want to kick this off?
Yes, thank you very much. And just noting that we do not have anyone present from Caltrain or BTA, so it'll just be city updates today. First update that I'd like to provide is regarding grants. I wanted to inform the Rail Committee and members of the public that the city submitted a grant for the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program with CalSTA or CalSTA on February 10th, just a few days, 5 days ago, and we submitted for Meadow, Charleston, and Churchill. It was a funding request for final design and right-of-way acquisition phase at all three of those crossings. Second, regarding the San Francisco Creek Bridge project, Caltrain and city staff met on site to do a review of the site conditions regarding impacts of the recent storm on the embankments and bridge conditions. And staff also has followed up with Caltrain to reiterate that we want them to provide alternative plans for rehabilitation and strengthening of the bridge, and also to perform a cost-benefit analysis in order to determine what the best path is. And Caltrain is still reviewing that request, and we hope we'll follow up soon. Regarding the Caltrain corridor study, Caltrain has had meetings with different stakeholders groups in January, and they met with the city and county staff which is known as the CSCG, and also with the LPMG. And the consultant, Kimley Horn, shared the project objectives and the timeline. And it includes an evaluation of the technical and strategy items, and the timeline for that study is approximately 1 year. At the last CSCG meeting, as part of the strategy efforts, the consultant is reviewing case studies of similar projects in the area, specifically MetroLink, Alameda County East project, Melbourne Level Railroad Crossing, and Long Island Railroad. Moving on to a project which has correlation to our grade separation projects. Excuse me. The Embarcadero Road bike improvements, which was previously a large CIP project. We've rescoped this project into a much smaller project where we're looking at the Emerson Avenue to Alma Street portion of Embarcadero Road. And we've been working with city procurement to get our consultant BKF engineers on board to perform this work. And BKF engineers are the consultant that had previously prepared the plans to nearly 100%. And so we are moving forward with that project. And we have a consultant on board now to review the plans and are repackaging the bid documents and plan to conduct a community outreach meeting. Finally, and this came up in the public comments regarding the quiet zone study. As you're aware, staff is working with Menlo Park and the consultant, which was hired for the quiet zone study at Palo Alto Avenue. And they're currently planning to conduct an outreach meeting, which is scheduled for March 23rd at 6 p.m. at the Arriaga Family Recreation Center, Oak Room 701 Laurel Street in Menlo Park. And notices will be sent out to both residents in the vicinity of the crossing and also through all of our social media communications. Yes, that's March 23rd, 2023 at 6 p.m. We'd be happy to follow up with more information about it. And with that, that concludes all of my comments. Happy to take any questions.
Great. So colleagues, any questions? I have a couple of comments and questions, but let you go first. Any?
I would like to ask just a clarification. You said you're meeting 6 p.m. Oak Room in where?
It's in the Arriaga Family Recreation Center, the Oak Room 701 at Laurel Street.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. That's all.
Yep.
And I was real glad to hear that things are proceeding on that Embarcadero bike and ped section between Alma
and Emerson.
Approximately. And you mentioned a community outreach meeting. When would that community outreach occur in this process? Is it, and I guess what I'm looking at is it going to be at a point, or maybe there need to be two, one where there's an opportunity to have input on prospective designs, and then another to have feedback on whatever is the tentative design that's been or the design that was developed by the consultant?
Yeah, I'm going to have to turn to Ripon to maybe answer that question, but just to give you the high level, this project was actually already at essentially 100% design. So really we're kind of past the point of getting comments on prospective designs, since we're way past the conceptual phase. This was already a CIP.
Well, I remember it was part of the design all the way to El Camino, and then
yep.
What I guess then I'm then a little less clear on what will be the design role of the consultant versus any construction implementation if we already have that design.
I'm going to turn it to Ripon Bhatia, our senior engineer, to clarify.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so in reference to that repackaging, so the original project was entirely big project, and so we are trying to repackage it. At the same time, we are reviewing to make sure that the proposed improvements are in line with the current standards and current, requirements from the highway design manual and other elements that we are, required to meet. So as part of that exercise, if there are any revisions or changes, we are hoping minor would be made and be able to come up with a community meeting so that because the plans have been, or the project has been finalized for a long time and people may not be familiar, and so be able to familiarize and fresh the minds of people, especially the ones who are in the fronting, and will be affected by that project. So we just want to make sure that we reach out and to the community and familiarize them with this. We would certainly have input and feedback, and if there is significant feedback that requires revisions or major changes, we can certainly look into a follow-up. But we are hoping that since these projects were finalized to the extent that they were having 100% feedback incorporated from the community as well as from other commissions and committees, that these projects should be ready in a project-ready format.
So that sounds good. So it sounds like the consultant is really to cross the T's, dot the I's, make sure we're in conformance with required standards. My recollection on this from 2016 is that when we had previously had the improvements be on the what we'll call the southeast side of Embarcadero, instead we said no, it really needs to be on the northwest side. Staff at that time came up with solutions that, frankly, I didn't get a chance to really review the details, and I don't think there was much of a council or committee or public process reviewing it, but I was in awe that they were able to fit it in and make significant improvements work within the physical constraints there. And I guess I'd like to request just if the committee can be shared where we left off on this, because I never saw the details and would love to see them, and others may be equally interested. And then, so that's our starting point. And it sounds like we're not expecting many changes at all.
Yeah, that's correct. And we'd be happy to bring that to the committee. Great.
And then just on the Caltrain and VTA issues, as most of you know, I'm now on the Caltrain board, and I'm chairing the LPMG group and chairing VTA. So I'm getting an opportunity to be in more constant engagement with all those bodies on their various issues. One of the big things that we've struggled with is we have this MOU that Caltrain has proposed to us, basically for Mountain View and Sunnyvale, to charge us their full costs for design review and then subsequently project management. VTA themselves have been interested in what their role would be, since through Measure B, VTA is coming up with they are the primary funding source. Caltrain had not historically had staff that was really had this capacity and expertise, although they've brought on some really, I think, excellent new teams to do this. But we and other cities have had real heartburn over that MOU understanding. We created an ad hoc committee of VTA of the Mountain View, Sunnyvale, and Palo Alto around grade separation issues. But Caltrain is having to charge the cities because they have no funding to do this themselves. And so us saying to Caltrain, you shouldn't charge us for this, is trying to squeeze water from a rock, unless they can be provided that funding. And one of the funding sources is that Congresswoman Eshoo had set aside $2 million toward the Sunnyvale 1 grade separation design and the 4 in Palo Alto. She had additional dollars that were even bigger ones toward some of the construction in Mount View and elsewhere. But is staff very familiar with that earmark that Congresswoman Eshoo got through for this purpose? It went to VTA, but it's Caltrain that we want to have funded to support this. So do you have any insights? It's something I intend to be talking with. I've already discussed it with Caltrain staff, and I intend to discuss it with VTA staff, but I just wanted to ask if you have any insights on that earmark, because I hadn't appreciated that had gone through with that designated purpose. It's really exciting that we got that, but I don't know any specifics on how that can be used to meet our needs.
As I recall, at the time that earmark was being requested, I believe, Philip, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but we sent in a letter of support for that. And it is accurate that I believe the grant recipient was VTA. So given that, I think it's a conversation with VTA as to how best to leverage it.
Well, I intend to have that conversation. Thank you. And let's see. And then the only other thing is just a little update on the LPMG. We have our next meeting coming up. Councilmember Lowing is our representative. He was already at the first LPMG meeting of the year, and that was really a carryover with the prior chair. I would say that Caltrain not only now has staff that we've met with multiple times that are their technical team on the whole grade separation, they also have engaged with the consultant group of Kimberly Horn, who has developed a really extensive engagement and outreach plan that I am impressed with both their plan and their staff. And there are a lot of times where consulting outreach is really to kind of check boxes. This is really substantive and well thought, and I'm very encouraged by what they have designed and how they're proceeding, and the capabilities and vision of those staff members. And I'm really hopeful on that process. But the other real challenge for Caltrain is how do they, like most of the transit agencies in the region, are facing a fiscal cliff, where with the ridership down and the revenue from fare box recovery having tanked, they're all in trouble on operational funding. And how do they rebuild the ridership in part, as well as looking for a government bridge over the next couple of years so that these agencies don't collapse, and a total collapse of our transit system in the region if they don't have this, what they're calling the fiscal bridge gap filled. And one of the things that I just wanted to share is that I've come to appreciate that Palo Alto was the second highest boardings in the system prior to the pandemic. In the pandemic period, it was actually the highest boardings. And that's a high percentage of a low number, but it's nevertheless even more than San Francisco, far more than Diridon in San Jose at this point in time. And then the question is, how did that happen? And it wasn't just happenstance. We had strong boardings traditionally, but we, in 2011, with the hospital development agreement, we had as a condition of approval GO passes, the Caltrain passes for there. Stanford actually expanded it beyond what we requested, which was for all the incremental increase in employees. They ended up deciding it's so good they extended it to all employees. Then we've had our TMA, where we came to understand that in the downtown area, The tech companies, big tech companies tended to have their own TDM programs. It was the small, lower income paying service businesses that really needed, their employees needed the help. And that's where our TMA is focused on, with either providing VTA Smart Passes or Caltrain Go Passes. And that expanded that and included into lower income riders. And Caltrain is historically not a system that provides lifeline service for low income transit users. It's an anomaly nationally in its income level and the fact that riders are typically discretionary riders, not necessity. So it's a different ballgame than most transit agencies. And then we got pushback from our own TMA to say, well, you're pushing all the businesses to do this. How about the city walking the walk? And we provide Go Passes for all of our City Hall area employees. And between those three measures, that's a real model for the cities up and down the corridor to follow. And for that matter, for the major trade groups of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group and Samsita and San Mateo County. So I say all this because I want to make sure that our staff is hearing and our public that I'm going to be pushing for whether there is an interest in cities up and down the corridor developing similar models to drive that ridership as a benefit. And it, frankly, in this era where we have remote work and many companies are trying to induce employees, either pushing or inducing them to have greater number of days at the office, and it also is affecting local economies, all the remote work, whether this Go Pass has become a real inducement for employees to come back to work, especially with the added dimensions of Caltrain, of the new downtown subway connection in San Francisco, and the with the new electrification, faster trains, and really modern, comfortable trains with Wi-Fi and comfort, really a business class ride. So that's a long way of saying that I think we may want to put together as a package what we've done and work with our business community on promoting it. And then once we've described that as a model, we can offer it to Caltrain and they can try to propagate it amongst up and down the corridor. And I think it's something that Palo Alto should be proud about, because when you really connect these things, that's why we're the biggest sporting in the system. It didn't fall from the sky. All right, long description, but I think these are important developments. And on that note, do we have any? Oh, I guess these are just verbal updates. We can move on to the action items, and just so that the public know, or a single action item of the work plan. I think what we can do is have the staff presentation, and then hear from members of the public, and then have the council discussion. Does that sound good? I'm going to call on Nadia Nyack, who is having been the ex-cap chair, is kind of an ex-official member of this committee. Did you have a question on that process?
I just had actually a question about the bike improvements on Embarcadero. So from what I recall, that plan included things that were on the north side of Embarcadero and also some improvements that extended to the El Camino intersection. And my understanding, I think, was that those are actually based on stuff that relates to Stanford. When Stanford goes over their numbers, we get money to improve intersections. And I thought some of those improvements related to those a long time ago.
The El Camino part?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so the question is, I know that was it was approved by council, it was approved in funding, it got dropped during the COVID sort of budget cuts, and now it's come back. And I don't understand the funding piece of this, so I'll stay out of that. But just trying to understand the previous argument for limiting the improvements to only the bicycle part along Embarcadero was because we didn't know at the time what council was going to decide in terms of Churchill improvements. If they chose to close Churchill, they would have had to improve the El Camino intersection. Since that has since been decided, or a preferred alternative for having a partial underpass at Churchill, that begs the question, do you need to come back and look at whether the improvements at Embarcadero, which were already approved by the previous council in 2016, still make sense? And I have I can send you guys what I found with the two alternatives. I think they had selected alternative 2. I'm trying to look that up while I listen to you guys, but so just a question on
Well,
how
maybe
we
that,
got to that
maybe
point.
maybe that should be something we look at in the context of the work plan too. Go ahead. Sorry, Phil.
Yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, I think I just want to note that I think there were multiple reasons why the El Camino portion was dropped, but at the time, you know, that entire CIP was eliminated. Within what we're trying to do right now is we see a small bite-sized chunk that we think that we can tackle easily without trying to go out and seek an additional CIP. We actually think it fits within an existing CIP that we have, which is bicycle and pedestrian transportation plan implementation. So we were trying to find a creative way to make sure that we got something done there. You know, I walked over there the other day and I just looked at it, and it's something that needs to be done. And we just saw that, we recognized it, and Ripon and I said, how can we get this done? So that's where we are.
Music to my ears. Okay. So Philip, would you like to kick off the discussion of the work plan? We have a member of the public said that they couldn't find the agenda item on the council website.
Yeah, I actually just clicked through to make sure it is there. It is there under action items.
Okay, great.
There's both the staff report, there's an attachment, and amazingly, our deputy city clerk even got the little one-page presentation thing that I have here. And just noting, I really don't have much to present today. I actually just want to share. This is really kind of an update on the work plan that was approved by City Council on August 8th, 2022, and to provide context for the planned work items that we have based on that work plan as it was adopted. So I guess actually, unless you want me to read off this or walk through each one of these, happy to just turn it over. Or happy to walk through them if the committee prefers that.
Why don't you walk through them at a high level?
Sure.
And then after we hear from the public, we can, as a committee, ask any follow-up questions or provide comments.
That sounds great. Okay, so I'm just going to dive into this. Let me make sure I'm calling it the right thing so somebody from the public could find it. Under action item 1, this is item 1 presentation, I believe. I'm going to look at the deputy city clerk, make sure I have this right. Is that, sorry.
Sorry, repeat that.
Is it item 1 presentation? Is that correct?
Yes, item 1 presentation.
And that can be found on the city website under this committee, this rail committee meeting. The first item that we have on this list is to review and approve the conceptual plan refinements that were based on the discussions of 2 study sessions that we had. One was continued back in late 2022. So what we'd be doing with that is we'd be bringing back the work that we've done on refining the the underpass alternatives at the 3 locations, Charleston, Meadow, and Churchill. We anticipate that will be ready in either March or April for discussion. The next item that we have on this list is the results of the geotechnical studies. And that would be an opportunity for the rail committee to discuss the implications of the findings of the technical studies on the grade separation alternatives. And that would be in August or September. Next, we have to receive the peer review of cost estimates for specifically the trench alternative, and then also to discuss the implications on the alternatives. That would also be in August and September. And currently Ripon is working to select a peer to do that cost estimate, looking at the different options that we have for that. The next item is to review the Caltrain service agreement for possible recommendation to City Council. And that was discussed a little bit earlier by Chair Burt. Noting that, we're still waiting for a response from Caltrain, but not that they're ignoring us. They're working on it. They're working on revising the agreement so that we can have a discussion soon, staff discussion, to make sure that addresses some of the concerns that we had, that actually I submitted a memo to the rail committee back in December, our December meeting on. And we hope that that would occur in May or June of 2023, or at least we would have, well, we'll update that as we hear back from Caltrain, but then, it is kind of pending their work. The next one is to receive the Caltrain update on the San Francisco Creek Bridge rehab and replacement, which I'd also mentioned in our staff updates. The item after that is regarding funding and legislative information and opportunities. It's ongoing staff updates. I provided one today. The next one was also referenced. That's to receive the Caltrain Corridor Crossing Strategy, which they're calling CCS. And that's their study, and also the issues regarding forward tracking and technical issues. And they've currently targeted approximately a year for that study, but we're expecting sometime between November and March that we'll receive that finalized study. The next item is regarding the bicycle and pedestrian transportation plan and considerations for the new east and west bike ped crossings for possible recommendation to City Council. That was actually brought up as well in public comments today. We're expecting that to occur sometime in approximately November to March timeframe. And the item after that is to review and provide feedback on the improvements for the implementation of quiet zones at California Avenue. And that's scheduled for April of 2023. And then we've got Rail Committee recommendation to City Council for the implementation of quiet zones to occur following that in August through September of 2023. And then the final item on here, which is maybe the most critical, is Rail Committee to provide a recommendation to City Council for either narrowing or selection of alternatives for grade separation. And that date is TBD. And with that, happy to take any questions or comments.
Well, I'll just say that I want to make sure everybody also sees the attachment A work plan, which takes what you've put down here as kind of a tentative meeting schedule, but the work plan gives much greater detail on the actual, it's 4 columns, the focus area, the rail committee activities, the time frame, and a progress report. And I found that to be really extensive and very helpful. And so I just wanted, for a purpose of our discussion, that probably gives us the greatest understanding of what Philip just summarized on each of these categories. So do we have any technical questions before hearing from the public and then returning to the committee for discussion?
Chair Bird, if I can just really quickly, thank you for referencing that attachment A. I just want to note that columns A, or the first 3 columns that you referenced, the focus issues, the planned rail committee activities, and the anticipated timeline, is what was approved by City Council. The last column, the progress update, is what we added as information for this specific meeting.
Thank you. I don't see it. Oh, Nadia?
So I had a couple of questions. One is, I know that we have potentially the report of the El Palo Alto tree coming forward, and kind of where are we on maybe touching base internally on what that means, then externally of what we're going to tell Caltrain, then kind of how that impacts everything. So I just want to flag that.
Yeah, thank you. We are definitely tracking that. That is very much tied to the San Francisco Creek Bridge issue. Yeah.
A second is when you, on the tentative work schedule where you have the thing about the BPTP bike crossings, how does that line up with any outreach that may or may not be needed for these different things? Yeah, particularly I'm thinking about SEAL, right?
Yeah. Okay. So yes, the SEAL, Well, just in general, the first part of the BPTP is to start with the community outreach.
Mhm.
So just I appreciate you bringing that up because that was a comment that we received, as you heard from Penny Ellison. So I'm not sure about the Q2 thing, and apologies, I'm really bad with the quarters, and I'm not sure if it's a calendar year quarter or fiscal year quarter or what the reference is. But this week we're actually planning to let procurement know who our selected vendor is. We just completed interviews. So
I'm sorry, that's the vendor on which?
This is the vendor for the BPTP, for the bicycle and pedestrian transportation plan. So we're working on getting the negotiation, the finalized scope following that notification this week. After that, the contract will get drafted very quickly by the city attorney. So we do expect that project to kick off fairly soon. And so I guess regarding timeline, as you asked the question about outreach, that's the first portion of the project, is to get outreach. Also, we've made that request to PIUSD to get their dot maps. We still haven't received that, but we hope that we'll get that soon. We did get a commitment from them that we would receive that. We do think that will help. Also, I'm not sure if you received, there was a study today that Arnott Bullens sent in regarding the crossing. I think that was sent to the rail.
And can you explain for folks what the dot maps are about?
Yeah, the dot maps, thank you. The dot maps that we've asked for PAUSD show where their students are traveling from in order to get to Pali. So that's why we're hoping to get that information. But just to note that in our refinement process, we do have a version of crossing at Seal and a version of crossing at Kellogg. So we've created that as part of our refinements for the underpass alternatives.
Is Kellogg still active? I thought, was there action on that?
This committee voted to remove it, but I don't know if
That get to the council? I'm trying to remember. The committee voted to not have any further work done on Kellogg, as I recall.
Good afternoon, Chair again. So our understanding is that the committee, that was a study session, and the objective was that we don't spend much effort on the Kellogg and look into a seal as an alternative. So while we thought, while when we were discussing, we mentioned that any concepts that are prepared for Kellogg will be applicable to the seal as well, because they have the same cross section and the same width and everything. So we were considering that there will be investment and understanding that these can be utilized on the seal if needed. And as part of the refinements, we would bring it as a comparison that will bring more light to the benefits of either.
That's helpful. I just want to make sure that the public understands that Kellogg is not actively being pursued and tentatively set aside as an alternative. Yeah. Great.
I was just going to make the comment that it seems like a really long time for us to be waiting for dot maps. So I don't know who's on the city school liaison committee, but maybe that can be flagged for whomever those whoever's the liaison now.
Duly noted.
I was going to also ask that you're looking at the dot maps because a member of the public brought it up. So where's the communication with the school at this point? With the district, I'm sorry, Palo Alto Unified. Are they involved in any more involved, or are they still sitting back?
So actually, the dot maps are something that we've been requesting on an ongoing basis from the school district. That's not just something that a member of the public brought up. That is something that we've been asking for on an active basis. And sometimes we get some of the dot maps specifically for the move to Greendale. We received dot maps, the temporary relocation at Cubberley. So
but
we
in the planning effort for grade separations, that has been slow in coming.
Yes, we've requested it. We did hear from the school district that we would get it. We have not yet received it.
Thank you.
We have at least even a latest, like what's the most recent version that we have? 2016, 2020? I mean, clearly 2020 would be a bad reference, but.
I'm not aware of any that we have for Pali within my tenure at the city.
So let's at this time, let's go ahead and open it up to members of the public who would like to speak on our agenda item, which is the 2023 calendar work plan. And first speaker is Penny Elson, to be followed by Laura Granka. Welcome. Penny, it should be your floor.
Oh, thank you. I want to follow up further on my questions about how these timelines align. So what I see in this, in the document that Philip Cami just showed, is that you anticipate starting to integrate BPTP information into your planning process sometime in starting in November. But the process, according to the work plan that we saw on Monday night, doesn't get approved by council until Q2 second quarter, which starts October of 2023. That's pretty late. So these timelines, from my perspective, do not align. And I just want to say that the public outreach process takes many months. The writing of this plan is a 2+ year, and approval of this plan is a 2+ year process, often 2 to 3 years. So I want to understand more fully how really that's going to happen. I think we need some detail on that, like what kinds of work in the BPTP planning process need to be prioritized in order to inform the rail committee in a timely way. And I appreciate, sort of the grand picture here, but I think we're missing the point. I mean, the South Palo Alto bicycle situation during construction period for grade separations and after construction is going to be far worse than what exists in North Palo Alto, because we have no existing grade separations of any kind, not dedicated for bikes and peds and not for cars either. And I'm concerned about SEAL also, but I am very, very concerned about what's going to happen for the kids in South Palo Alto who presently are commuting by bicycle to school. And I just want to remind everyone here that every student who rides a bike to school is taking 4 car trips per day off the road, because it's a trip in and out in the morning, a trip in and out in the afternoon. That's 4 car trips per day. You will have to accommodate all of those additional car trips during the construction period without the necessary road capacity, with less road capacity than we have today. I don't understand how that happens, and I think we need to be planning for it. And I don't see the alignment of these timelines that enables us to, provide information that enables staff to do that planning in a timely way. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Laura Granka. Welcome.
Hi, thanks so much. I had two questions. One, thanks for the great overview, but first one is, what's the criteria by which you'll commence and expand the quiet zone study beyond Palo Alto Avenue? Again, I just think quiet zones would be a significant improvement to the community overall, given that grade separation seems to be a long way off. And so just wanted to know if there was clear criteria by which we'll expand beyond Palo Alto Ave. And then second, I was aware that there's some ongoing safety improvements for some other intersections, notably Churchill Avenue. And like the sidewalk will be kind of expanding a little bit. And I was just curious if I didn't see that in the work plan. I didn't know if this was committee or another, but just wanted to make sure some of those improvements were still on the table such that in the interim, we can improve the safety overall. And then with that one, if there was any opportunity to modify that design slightly just to make it improve it a little bit more for pedestrians. I know there was another option that removed one lane of vehicular traffic on Alma from 4 lanes to 3 lanes going southbound. But if there was an option to put that back on the table just to leave a little more room for the bikes and peds. But beyond that, just wanted to make sure that this safety improvement was still on the table. Thanks.
Thank you. And that appears to conclude our public comments. And so we can now return to the committee for questions and discussion. And we have time to go through this in a thoughtful and detailed way. This committee meeting was scheduled all the way to 4. We're rolling along pretty well. And so feel free to go through this in good depth. It's going to be important for us to really make sure that we've set the year's agenda in a way that's going to reflect our priorities and our sequencing, because that ends up being part of the challenge of what needs to come first in order for something else to occur. And a lot of these have a lot of interplay with each other. And so we need to think those things through. And I just encourage us to have good, thoughtful dialogue on this over the next hour or so. So who would like to go first? Councilmember Lowing.
Yeah, I want to just address one of the big picture items first, which is item A on the attachment A, but also ties to the last thing on the green sheet of the one-page presentation. And that is that it says additional studies will take up to a year, depending on start date and other criteria. And then on the tentative schedule for Rail Commission's recommendation to council, it's TBD. At the end of the year, because it's about a year. So I just want to get kind of a understanding for overall messaging to the public that this is probably another year before we can actually make recommendations to council and council can act on it. But I'm welcome to have you push back on that just for the clarity of where we are in the big picture. And if you want to itemize, what are some of the dependencies that you reference? And I know some of them, but I'd rather just leave it open-ended, let you answer it.
Well, yeah, and I want to, I guess I would agree with that, but I want to also clarify that the rail committee could make a decision that maybe one of any of these many criteria or one of these items on here is the deciding factor. So that's the one thing that, I mean, like as an example, the trench alternative cost estimates that could come back and still be very high. And the rail committee might say, let's eliminate the trench from consideration. Okay. So those are kind of and I think Chair Burt described this really well. There's so many dependencies between different things that any one of these list of items could determine whether an alternative continues to be viable or makes it more viable. So I think that's the challenge in kind of predicting when this could all complete. But I do think, if, some of the things might be worth waiting for is the.
When on the trench in particular, when it gets around, I think I've got a suggestion on something on that. So
just to break it down into the 4 intersections, if, for example, the Churchill partial bypass, we get whichever the 2 variables are here that give us all of the data, and we understand the funding, for example, we could move on that one in June before we make other recommendations in December or end of year. I'm just kind of testing the flexibility here.
Yeah, well, I think Churchill specifically is one that maybe is a little bit easier because it's the council's already selected a preferred alternative for that one, and we're really refining that one.
That's why I picked it.
Yep. Yeah. So that's a great example.
Mayor Koo.
Thank you. So number B on attachment A, I was just wondering, is there any way to kind of have approximate funding for some of the things that we're doing? You know, say for example, if it's a trench, would you be able to get a ballpark figure about what a trench would cost, or, you know, the underpass and so forth? Then at least when we're looking at all of this, there's numbers behind it. Even with studies, you know, when you're doing analysis of things.
Yeah, so the trench is a little bit of a strange example. No offense, but because we're trying to seek a revised cost or a peer review of the cost estimate. But we have cost estimates for all of the alternatives
So it's
currently
okay.
that exist on our Connecting Palo Alto website,
Okay.
and I'll be happy to show you where. But each alternative has a fact sheet that has a cost estimate associated with it. And there's also the matrix, thank you, which has a comparison of all the costs across. And actually the XCAP report has all of that
Has all of
information as
that.
well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of wondering if that there might be a way that it's more visible just itself. So if that can be done. The other one is, so if I understand correctly, Caltrain created a what is that called? CCS committee.
Yes, CCS.
In order to review the questions that we asked them for the designs?
Not exactly. The CCS is a study. It's the study that actually they'd been promising for years that they were going to kick off. And we had been, it does answer, or it can answer, some of the questions that we've been asking. So that's contained in it, but it's actually not for us specifically. It's for the entire corridor.
And the acronym is for
What is it? It's Caltrain Corridor Crossing Strategy. So it's Corridor Crossing Strategy. It's very confusing. We've got CSS, we've got CCS, too many TLAs. We don't want any more three-letter acronyms.
now?
That's a three-letter acronym.
Okay, at least we know that now. So obviously, you know, I mean, with them kicking off this committee to do this study, or the answers are going to be coming back pretty late, and we're trying to move ahead. So I think that's an understanding that people need to have. It's not us continuing on with discussing. It's actually also responsibility on their part, not providing some of the answers to us. And if it's a corridor project, you know, up and down, we're all dependent on each other, and need this study to be completed ASAP.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why we've been pushing on them so hard for so many years to get this going. And they had staffing issues, and they managed to get it kicked off. But as Chair Burt mentioned, it's Kimberly Horn that's actually leading this,
Right?
and
it's encouraging. You know?
We've had very encouraging meetings with them as well, staff. We think that they've got a good process set up to get this project going.
I guess it's a good reminder that it should be thought through first before they initiate a project, you know, and so we're all sitting around waiting and trying to get it going. But okay, thank you.
And this is kind of a problem because all of our residents don't understand that. So there's an important messaging issue here as we go forward on the year.
Absolutely. And just further context for that, historically, what Caltrain did is each grade crossing that a city would propose in the corridor over the years and decades, if they needed to have any design differences from the very kind of limited existing technical and design standards, they would have to submit for Caltrain to review that as a one-off, and for Caltrain to charge the city for the review of that one-off, whether it is a bridge deck or a thickness, or like Mountain View has done, or a different construction method that saves time and money, like the jackbox construction or the vertical grade or the vertical curve. And with our Palo Alto generally being a constricted corridor, meaning narrow and built out on either side, our grade crossings are more challenging than most of the rest of the grade crossings in the corridor. So we've needed, if we wanted to have solutions that either lowered the cost or had fewer impacts on the community, we have a whole series of exceptions that we would be pursuing. But Caltrain has already acknowledged that most of the things that we would call exceptions are things that they will likely be building into new technical standards that would be the norm of what's allowed, and then a narrower set of things that might be exceptions. And I agree with you fully. I would really like us to look at having staff compose maybe a draft of explanation of this for the public. And we as a committee, or I would be glad to review it, to have it so that we're communicating these basic concepts in a way that everybody understands. Here's where we are and what we're hinging on, and what we need from Caltrain so that we can move forward. Okay. Well, let me wade into several other specifics. And I felt maybe if I use the tentative schedule as a first reference point, not sure if you can point to me where in the work plan it correlates. So the third item is peer review cost estimates of trench alternatives and their implications. And I guess that's a subset under the various like A, looking at design alternatives. So on the trench, correct me if I get any of this wrong, but we had wanted it wasn't a viable option for Churchill, nor Palo Alto Avenue, which we aren't actively pursuing. And so it was only a possibility for Meadow and Charleston. One of the key things that we're looking for from Caltrain is they are required to have a passing track section of somewhere 3 to 4 miles from what we thought was South Mountain View up to north edge of Palo Alto. We've recently had a clarification that they had a couple years ago ruled out far South Mountain View up to Castro. And so it's a narrower distance that is possible. In Palo Alto, not only are we built out next to the corridor, but in North Palo Alto, particularly around Churchill and Pierce Park, it's amongst the narrowest in the entire corridor, 60-something feet. But Caltrain is needing to look at a 3 to 4 miles of passing tracks. It's pretty clear, and they've acknowledged that in that Churchill area and really north of Oregon as a result, it's just not at all likely that they will choose that section as part of those 3 to 4 miles. They haven't officially ruled it out, but it just seems not possible. And now that we now know that the area that they'd be considering is from Castro, essentially north to Oregon, that means Charleston and East Meadow are likely areas that Caltrain will need to reserve the possibility of 4-track. Our alternatives don't have to be built for 4 tracks. We just can't preclude a future 4-track in the design. When we've looked at trenching, that was one option that if you went to 4 tracks, my recollection is it's really infeasible. Not only it drives up the cost enormously, but that would be their problem. But from a fit standpoint and a construction impact, a 4-track trench, you can't build a 2-track trench and come back and do a 4-track later either. That's the other problem. And so what I'm leading up to is, because we now are recognizing that trench for those reasons, unfortunately, is even less feasible than we had hoped for. We were hoping that maybe the cost could be lower than was projected. Are we really at a point where there's no point in pursuing further the trench alternative for those reasons? And do we need to get to a decision point on that so that we don't spend more time and money pursuing something that many of us were interested in when it was a 2-track possibility, but it just can't work for 4 tracks? So that's a question I have. First, Philip, do you have any feedback on that? And then including, if we hear from colleagues that is kind of makes sense, how would we proceed to, as a committee, do we need to get this back to the council as an early, as we, we're not going to wade through all this and have all these recommendations to council at once. Do we break off certain things that can help us accelerate our process because we're facing up to certain realities that have now emerged?
Okay, I'll do my best to respond to that. First, I just want to note that I think Caltrain is actually the ones requiring the passing tracks because it's no longer required by high-speed rail.
Technically, but Caltrain needs it because of high-speed rail. So high-speed
Yes.
rail wants to say it's not us,
Yeah.
but they can't operate. Caltrain can't operate their future train service level if high-speed rail is here, unless
That's
they
right.
have the passing tracks.
It's also for their enhanced service vision.
That's right. So you
Yeah.
combine their future service model with their required to allow for high-speed rail to someday be on the corridor, and you put the two together and they have no choice but the passing tracks.
Yep. Okay. But coming back to your question, thanks. And that does, I think, merit some conversation or some explanation to the public that might be confused by it. I do think that there's now, of course, one thing that we don't have yet is we don't have confirmation from Caltrain that they will require this 4-track. We are assuming that they possibly might, but we don't have clarification.
You mean that at that location?
At that location, that's correct.
They have clarified that they will need it in that zone, right?
That's right, and that does kind of come back to something that Member Koo had mentioned earlier regarding whether we need to wait for Caltrain to finish this, because Caltrain did offer to provide us answers to some of our questions in an expedited fashion if we were to essentially pay them to do that work ahead of time. So just mentioning that. But to answer your broader question, yes, I think there's value if we think, if the committee believes that the trench is no longer viable at any point in this time, to remove that from consideration, because then we can spend more time focused on the alternatives that we do think have more merit or more likelihood of success. So short answer to the question, but I think there is value in that if we've decided that we think that is the direction that Caltrain is going to head.
So do we have that data is the question?
Which data?
The data to make the decision that we should pull.
No. So what Philip was really saying is, and this goes, I think it was our last meeting of the year, where Caltrain came forward and basically said, we have this proposed MOU, and if you will pay us, we will answer these questions. Now, as I said earlier, they don't have funding to do it for free. Unfortunately, we need to get them the funding so they don't have to charge us. But within that discussion, I said, okay, I understand certain things are technical and design standards. And we have one question of our concerns over being charged for that. But this 4-track system is not an issue of where we stand on asking for a standard. This is a Caltrain decision. And we also asked and have not received from Mountain View or otherwise, how did Mountain View extract the clarification or the decision from Caltrain to not include from Castro to the southern edge of Mountain View? And have we gotten any response on that?
Just to note that they sent a letter requesting it, but according to Caltrain, there was not a response to that. So,
all right, I will follow up on that.
Yeah,
myself.
But sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I was just going to mention that. Oh, give me a second; it'll come back to me. Sorry. No, it's got it right.
So I will pursue with Caltrain that the answer to that. Now, the letter that Mountain View sent, did we get a copy of that?
Yes.
Has the committee seen it?
I'm not sure. We'll check and follow up on that.
Okay, good. If we could see that. In fact, if I could get it shortly, so that if I'm going to pursue this directly with Caltrain, I can have that reference point.
Sounds good. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I remembered what I was thinking is our pushback to Caltrain is exactly as you described, that that really we were not asking them for like a design exemption or something where we needed something for our design. This was a decision that Caltrain needs to make about where the forward tracking needs to occur. This is a business decision for their operation, and therefore something that they should be helping us by telling us, not something that we should be paying for them to tell us.
Exactly. Thank you. All right. And then I had a question on your fourth item, which was review of the Caltrain service agreement. Well, I'll just first, sorry, before we leave the previous one on the trench. So we had that tentatively scheduled for August, September. I think we don't want to be held up on, we can't really do any of these other discussions around Charleston East Meadow. Well, we could do things, but removing something that's infeasible from the options will help accelerate our decision making. And so I think we really want to resolve this 4-track issue, especially as it relates to the trench option, as soon as possible. And then we can perhaps move forward on some just dropping that from the list, frankly.
Yeah, thank you. I would concur with that.
Yeah. And I say that as somebody who had hoped we could consider a trench.
If I may, I'm just looking at Google Maps, and if you take the very kludgy tool that Google Maps has to measure from Castro Street just to Meadow, it's exactly 3 miles. So, I mean, by sheer logic, if the Castro decision is approved, then there's no way that they're not going to turn around and tell us that we can't, that we don't have to certainly plan for, to not preclude 4
Yeah, not
tracks.
preclude.
Yeah.
But if we remove the trench quicker than what this thing says, then we would be saving ourselves the review of the trench cost estimate. And in addition, I mean, there's geotechnical studies, which we need anyway for the underpass. I don't think we really save anything there, but it does help move that forward. I did just want to flag for you, and I'm sorry to sort of jump ahead the rest of your comments, but I've been hearing from folks that are following the feedback that Payback has been giving on the alternatives. And it troubles me that because the viaduct was eliminated from the alternatives at the time, they're only giving feedback on the 3 remaining alternatives, which would make sense. It's the trench, the hybrid, and the underpass. However, if you solely put on your bike helmet, for a second, and only thought about bikes, you kind of have 2 ways of thinking about bike crossings. It's either the ideal form of bike crossings if you have to cross Alma, of which the obvious answer is flat is best, which makes the viaduct the best option for the bike community. And if you have to look at something where you are going to skip Alma from a biking perspective and not have to have them interface with cars, then you would improve the underpass in some way. So I just want to say that if there's a consideration of removing the trench, I do think it makes sense to discuss the viaduct, not just for the bike community's perspective, but also because it takes much less construction time. And one of the things that we've never put a value on is how much shorter of a construction period. And I believe it's like I think it's 2 years less than the hybrid. Even though there's a cost difference, there's a price to that. And that all ties into something which is actually on attachment A, letter A. The very first bullet is review grade separation selection criteria for any revisions. We haven't looked at that criteria since 2017. And now would probably be a good time to think about, okay, what are we actually optimizing for? Because ultimately the cost estimates we get from the consultants are just for the stuff that they're building, but doesn't account for all the disruption that we're going to have. And so I just want to say that I think if I'm trying, I recognize that the idea is to pare down the alternatives and not keep adding stuff back on the table, but I would be remiss if we didn't highlight that and think about, if you really are going to remove the trench, if Payback is going to the trouble of giving comments, do they also give comments on the viaduct alternative? Because that makes the most sense from a bike perspective. So just want to throw that out there.
Well, thanks. And so that let me try to fold that into a couple of comments here. So one is, if we are at a point where the trench isn't viable because we're going to have to allow for 4 tracks in that area, are we otherwise in the process of having additional work on the peer review costs, the trench alternatives? Is anything actively going on in that?
We've just received bids on that, noting it's a sub-consultant that would be through our AECOM, but we actually requested that we can review the bids and select which vendor would provide that pure estimate. So all we're doing right now is reviewing the bids for that. We have not, unless Ripon tells me otherwise, I think we asked for additional clarification on some of the tasks, but we have not selected a vendor yet, so that has not started.
So should we give guidance as a committee on a recommendation that we hold off on those expenses until we hopefully can get an answer on the 4-track and make a determination of whether we don't want to expend those dollars and add that time?
Apologies. The reason I'm glancing at Ripon is I'm trying to think back to what the council direction was regarding this. I know that they approved the contract. I don't know that they directed us specifically. Did they direct us to do this?
Okay.
So the council did direct us to do this. So that's the only catch that I have, but I'm not sure that there's harm in us holding on that.
We can hold it, and it could be something that we add to the early recommendations of the committee to the council for any adjustments that we'd want to do early this year, so that we're on a best path. Okay, so why don't we start composing a tentative list of things that we may want to take to the council for concurrence with committee recommendations, and that would be one.
I'd like to
Yes.
add something. If since we're talking about the trench and the possibility of putting it on the side and not working on it, I think that outreach to South Palo Alto needs to happen. They are actually looking. There are quite a large number of them that are looking at a trench and are quite vocal about a trench, because right now the underpass is not very clear about what it's going to look like, especially with the U-turn and the circle and potential of housing being taken away. So I think that it's going to require quite a lot of communication and clarity for people in South Palo Alto. So I do have the concern of us here talking about potential elimination. So I want to put that out.
Point. It may be starting to become clear to us, but we've got to make sure that we share the reasons for that with the community. Okay. Related then to this A of refining our alternatives, we have the fourth. Well, we have several different items that are related to this, but we have the Caltrain service agreement, which affects how we get answers from Caltrain on some of these things that today would be technical or design exceptions, but going forward, may be standards, and we could either proceed and pay them to, because if we want answers, before they've gone through this process over the next year or so of their new technical standards, we'd have to pay them to do this one-off. And maybe this goes back to this earlier question about Congresswoman Eshu's earmarks, because the description of that earmark sure looks like it could cover our cost to go forward with Caltrain pursuing our needs as exceptions, even as if we wish they would instead have already gotten to the point where they had new standards. And maybe that's a solution to how we move forward without it costing us as a city a bunch of money, is that we can tap into that funding source to move forward on that. And so that involves discussion with VTA on their understanding of the uses of those dollars, and with Caltrain on where they really stand on the timeline on the new standards. And I think we have that in there, the timeline that Kimberly Horn has given us. And I think, as I recall, we're looking at a good year before we get answers. And if we don't want to wait that long, in part because waiting means we lose even more opportunities to tap in to one-time massive federal funding from the Infrastructure Act that are going to be, I say one time, but they're spread over, we think, about a 5-year period. And the first year has already passed. Mountain View was able to tap into that. We want to make sure in the subsequent years we're far enough along that we can also tap into those funds.
Councilmember Bird.
Construction. Yes.
You might also, part of the challenge has been that the only work we've done is on 2-track alternatives. We've never done any 4-track alternative work. You might want to let it be known to Representative Eshu's office that we are unable to use the money that she has secured for us because we're not getting an answer from Caltrain about the location of the 4 tracks. That might actually help speed things up, because if they come back and say, okay, definitely you have to allow for 4 tracks, then we can go and ask our things as a design exception, because we already have designs to discuss. We have the 2-track alternatives that we know should not necessarily impede with those.
If that's necessary, I wouldn't hesitate to do that. I'm somewhat optimistic that, given that I now have a greater engagement with Caltrain as a board member, that we can shake this tree. And hopefully fruit will fall. And not a branch on our heads. Okay. And I'm just, sorry, looking at my notes. Nadia brought up this issue of that it's been several years since we reviewed the selection criteria. And what we've really done is we've had a de facto evolution in the criteria that we talk about without going back and redefining the criteria and having the criteria reflect what we really recognize, or maybe a shift in some of the criteria. And so if it seems that really the decision making should be based on criteria, and it implies to me that maybe in our next March meeting, as a starting point, we should have a review of the criteria and update them to reflect our current best understandings. And that is based in a significant degree on not only what we as a committee have done, but what the XCAP had done, and input from the community. That's all caused us to have a refined understanding of what criteria should we really be using, and certain circumstances have changed. So, colleagues, what do you think about that issue of putting the criteria review on the March meeting?
I think that makes great sense. Anything that's, whatever that is, 6 years old.
Not to mention you and Vicky haven't really gone through them.
Are new, that's right.
Yeah. Sound good?
Sounds reasonable.
All right, got a thing done. Okay. Let's see. Jumping down to, and I apologize for going out of sequence here, but on the quiet zones, and we've got down here under your plans in April and then August, first the committee review and then council recommendation on that. But that's specifically on Palo Alto Avenue. Members of the public have asked about the other grade crossings because, you know, we could have many years before we construct all three of these other grade crossings. Philip, any thoughts on inclusion of quiet zones in the other locations?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to have to let Ripon maybe expand on whatever I say here, but just I do think that what we can do is we can take Palo Alto, where we've got a consultant and there's some economy of scale and having a combination of the work that they're doing in Menlo Park and for us in Palo Alto. So I think the Palo Alto Avenue can be used as an example as something that then we can apply to the other crossings. I'm not sure what work would be necessary for that, so I'm going to turn it to Ripon to see what that is. But that's our thought, is that we would use that as an example to apply to the other crossings.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. Yeah, to add to that is that we do plan on having an RFP out by end of this year, so we can have a consultant on board to do the three other crossings and have it on our plan.
That sounds great. And so that everybody understands, the one at Palo Alto Avenue, we're working with Menlo Park on and sharing resources. And so if we can have that reflected in the work plan, that it's not just Palo Alto Avenue, but that may be, that's the impetus for the others. That would help people understand that we're looking at all of them. Yes.
If I may, can you give us an idea of what step right now is taking place with the Palo Alto Avenue Quiet Zone? Where are they at?
Yeah, currently we are in the outreach phase of the original study. So we have developed a conceptual plan with meeting with the CPUC and Caltrain, so adhering to the standards of the FRA to develop a alternative that would be likely acceptable to CPUC and FRA for approval of the quiet zone. And so we are seeking feedback from our community as our first step, which is on March 23rd. And we'll bring back also to the Rail Committee that same information we were hoping in April. And that will be another opportunity for the public to provide an input, as well as the Rail Committee to get that information. We were hoping that we would also communicate with other committees that we have in the city that will also give a platform for our community to provide feedback to for the conceptual plans. So once the feedback and outreach is complete, we would finalize the plan based on the Rail Committee's input and direction as well. And we could make a recommendation. So the finalized concept plan would be recommended to the City Council end of this study for implementation of this quiet zone. So the implementation of the quiet zone starts from a GO 88 application from CPUC, which is an approval from CPUC and construction, and having an agreement with Caltrain and CPUC to construct those improvements, and then request, once the improvements are complete, then we would request for a quiet zone to be installed by FRA.
That looks like in September or end of the year.
So it would be in front of council for recommendation to implement between, I think we said August to September.
Great, thank you. So in terms of the outreach that you mentioned or engagement, is that going to be Menlo Park that is going to be doing it, or is Palo Alto also doing an outreach to the community for the conceptual plans?
So as a community outreach, the first community outreach meeting that we are planning is in collaboration with City of Menlo Park. That's why it is in the Menlo Park, and Menlo Park has 4 other intersections, which are much more complicated. And we are all doing it as one community meeting, but we will be meeting virtually with our stakeholders, different stakeholders, and providing opportunity, and also at Rail Committee for our constituents and stakeholders to provide feedback. We will be notifying the residents within the vicinity of the Palo Alto crossing for that community meeting for the March 23rd.
Well, that was part of my next question. We've had a number of speakers. We know 101 Alma and others there. So they presumably they have some sort of a, I don't know if that's a condo or it's a condo group. And so we could go through that organization to do an outreach, and not limited to those residents, but
so we'll be noticing all the nearby houses and businesses and all of that. In addition, we'll be doing social media and all of our regular communication channels.
But in addition to kind of the standard noticing, if we just meet with the leadership of that association, I think they will help promote this within their group.
So we developed a list of all the residents, which include all the apartments within that. There are 700 about, and we are sending mailers to them for this meeting.
Yeah, but I'm saying specifically, our 101 Alma is the most severely impacted, and they have an organized group, and engaging and letting them really help us.
Yeah, we will make sure that they're included in this outreach.
And then because we're now saying the quiet zones are also something that the evaluation of Palo Alto Avenue one will potentially lead right into Churchill, East Meadow, and Charleston. I think we want to have the outreach for this March 27th meeting in Menlo Park, including folks who may be interested on those other 3 grade crossings, and get the word out to them. Because now that we're saying, hey, this is going to be the ability to move right from Palo Alto Avenue into these others, they're going to be interested.
So we would have a separate outreach once we start the process for those other crossings, which would be in the other RFP. Of course, anybody be welcome to go to those.
Yeah, I'm just saying that we want to get the word out about that meeting to everybody who's interested in quiet zones, because this is the foundational meeting on it.
Yes, we are planning on including it on the city calendar to make sure that the whole city is aware of it.
Okay, so beyond
the city calendar, the social media, all of our normal communications channels.
Nadia?
I think we had an email list also for anyone who's following the XCAP process. You might want to blast that list as well.
Yeah, they will certainly be included. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Then I wanted to next wade into the issue of the bike and ped crossings. And just to frame it for everybody, we came to recognize the last year or more that sequentially, if we're going to go and do this massive construction project, just so that everybody kind of recalibrates that the estimate is that these grade crossings will be the largest, most disruptive, and most expensive infrastructure projects in Palo Alto ever. So other than that, just piece of cake. But we realized that particularly in Palo Alto, with our safe routes to school and our whole kind of leading bike mode share, that when we go to construct the new vehicular grade crossings that today are also bike and ped crossings, as limited as they are for safety in those regards, that we would disrupt the ability of kids to go to and from school by bike. In our 50% approximately of our kids who are doing that, many of them crossing at the grade crossings. And therefore, we've been looking at moving forward with dedicated bike and ped crossings ahead of the vehicular ones. And that we also last year had explained to us from multiple agencies of Caltrain, VTA, Senator Becker's staff that said there is a lot of funding available for active transportation, meaning bike and ped, construction like this, and that we wouldn't necessarily have to even tap into our Measure B dollars, perhaps, for even construction dollars. So that we need to do it first, that we have potential other funding once we get to the point where we've identified the locations and preliminary designs. And then even after that, those discussions, we've had really additional funding sources opening up at the federal and state level. And so the discussion we had last year was, how do we reconcile that with, we don't yet have our new bike and ped master plan. And that's why staff has framed it as they had on some choices that we have of how do we either go forward in parallel with the new bike and ped master plan, which I think would be ideal, that we don't wait another year or two to get the bike and ped master plan to begin this process and hold up the whole sequencing of our grade crossings, and make ourselves less eligible for funding that may evaporate by the time or be reduced by the time we would otherwise be pursuing it if we waited after the bike and ped master plan was developed. One point I had made previously is that in regards to the grade crossing in the vicinity of Loma Verde, the council back a couple of years, 3 or 4 years ago, had referred that consideration to the NVCAP process. And the NVCAP process really didn't move forward on that. And so it wasn't coupled as part of the XCAP and the grade crossing processes. Second, that our existing bike and ped master plan, going back how many years, I'm not sure. Pardon me?
2012.
2012. It and maybe even the previous one had identified the intention to have a crossing in the vicinity of Loma Verde all the way back then. So it's not like it's a new concept; it just hadn't been acted on. And then we've got that one, which, as Penny Elson had correctly noted, south of California, Oregon and California Avenue, we have no vehicular grade separations and no bike and ped grade crossings. North of Oregon, we have the Cal Ave bike and ped underpass, as antiquated as it is, and we have Embarcadero for bike and ped, 100-year-old and not adequate, but it's something. We have the Homer undercrossing, and then, as bad as it is, we have a university. So we have 4 north of Oregon and none south of Oregon, which in my mind, in addition to this sequencing issue, it's also a priority for the community. We have, I don't know, the Safe Routes School Committee could let us know how many hundreds, if not thousands, of kids are crossing at grade today. It's a mass, not to mention other people in the community who bike and ped. And then we've just adopted, or we haven't adopted, I should correct myself. We referred to a future council meeting as a work plan priority, the safe systems, or you could think also called safe streets, which are to really look at integrated safe systems for cars, bikes, and pedestrians. And I would say that at-grade crossings are certainly high on that list of areas that we are risks to safety and yet more complicated and more expensive to solve than many of the other solutions that we have. That's all a big wind up to saying that I would like to encourage us to look at how do we move forward on basically the decision to pursue bike and ped grade separations in South Palo Alto sooner rather than later. So let me pause there. First, asking Philip if you have any feedback, and then my colleagues on that concept.
Okay. Actually, I have quite a bit of feedback. I almost think this could be a whole meeting where we just discuss this. But just, yeah, and sorry, just to dive in really quickly, I want to first state that when we plan construction of whichever alternative we select at the Charleston, Meadow, Churchill, all of these, we would intend to include mitigations for bicycles and pedestrians to get through, even if on a temporary basis. Ripon actually, in his prior life, has constructed a temporary vehicular access. So not a bike and ped, but a temporary vehicular access that was built, a bridge that was built to go over a bridge that was getting built. So just to note that we would make sure that bicycle and pedestrian access is not removed when we're in construction. We would make sure that we maintain bicycle and pedestrian access. So I just want to put that out there. Then a secondary issue that I want to note in all this is relating to what Member Lowing had mentioned earlier, which is there's a lot of dependencies. One such dependency for starting additional crossing is figuring out whether the rail is going up or the rail is going down, because we don't know if we're looking at a tunnel. We don't know if we're looking at an overcrossing. We don't know really what we're looking at until we know that. So just want to note that as one of the.
Can I pause, because I realized one, I didn't mention one thing, and second on that. So the crossing in the vicinity of Loma Verde would be outside of either elevating or depressing tracks. Pardon me?
I think he said it may not be. It kind of depends on the alternative that's selected.
If there was a viaduct even, or a trench, or a hybrid, it's outside of that zone. And then the other thing that I neglected to mention is that on this list, so in the vicinity of Loma Verde, it is in the southern part of Palo Alto, but it's the northern 1/3 of that southern part. So we haven't been able to, and this ties into what you're saying, Philip, is that south of there, however we deal with bikes and peds, gets tied in with the design for the vehicular separation. The alternatives we're looking at right now is the bike and peds are integrated with that, but there are concerns that the community and the Bike Advisory Committee has had with how well that addresses those needs. But I don't think we can really separate that decision from narrowing our decisions on the vehicular design. It could mean that we would have a dedicated bike and ped crossing. I'll say south, or in the vicinity of East Meadow or south of there, or it could be that we come up with solutions that are the best alternative that integrate it. So that one we can't really separate it. I think Loma Verde, we could separate it and move forward on a more accelerated basis. Conceivably, we could do so also in Seal and separate that, but I put that as a lower priority than the one at Loma Verde. And so my pitch is that we look at what we can peel off and get going on, and perhaps get funding and the construction on soonest, that will alleviate some of the stresses from what we would then do later. Sorry for that interruption.
That's quite all right. I think Rippon's trying to pull up the hybrid, which it looks like might be right up against Loma Verde. So just want to note that. But regardless of that, stepping back, what we've set up and what council has directed us to do is to use the bicycle and pedestrian transportation plan to look at the possibility for new east-west crossings. We do believe that public engagement is necessary, even for Loma Verde, because our understanding is that there was severe negative reaction from some members of the public to that crossing. We also want to look at our bicycle and pedestrian network as a whole. We want to look at it holistically. We want to make sure that we're not just building a crossing that doesn't connect to anything. And so that is one of the keys in our bicycle and pedestrian transportation plan, is to look at the entirety of the city and how the bicycle network connects. So that is one of the first parts of our work that we'll be doing in the bicycle and pedestrian transportation plan, is doing community outreach to make sure that we are hearing how our community wants to see our bicycle and pedestrian network function. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question.
I would just say that, you know, we had looked at an east-west need in that same vicinity back in 2015 or so, when we looked at whether we could have a dedicated off-road bike route in the Matadera Creek Valley Water right-of-way. So it was really identified and considerable work pursued on something that we found that we couldn't fit it in there, but that's already established, and a whole bunch of work and a whole bunch of recognition that what we'll call an east-west route there is severely lacking. I don't think that's an open issue. And then we've had this discussion within multiple years of the NVCAP that said we need to have that bike route go through there, and hopefully ultimately have a better connection all the way to what we'll call the north-south route of Bull Park. So we have these parallel paths of essentially Hanover and Bull Park and then Park Boulevard on the west side, we'll call it, of Caltrain. We have Bryant and even Cowper and Byron and Lewis all running parallel on the other side. What this community has lacked for a long while is routes that are perpendicular to that. And this vicinity of Loma Verde, and I'm not convinced, the staff had subsequently looked at, well, should we have a bike boulevard or a bike path on Loma Verde? I personally don't think the best solution is to put the cars and the bikes on the same street, but that's why I keep saying in the vicinity. But I think this is well established as that being a really significant gap in our bike system. So I appreciate that we don't want to look at these things in isolation, but I don't think it's an open question as to whether that's a need. I think that has been established for better part of a decade with several different initiatives that were supposed to proceed on that very zone or that area to come up with a solution. The exact path is another question, but I think that's very well established in our community, and we've made efforts and we haven't gone forward. That's different from, geez, we got to decide whether we have a need there. I don't think that's an open question.
If I could add one more comment, I think, and I thought Mr. Camry was going to go there, but since he didn't, I will. It's the issue of perhaps sequencing and how best to accomplish the work. Again, focusing specifically around additional bike crossing in the South Palo Alto area. For better or for worse, what we have done in the Churchill area has been to look at the bike crossing as an element of the bike transportation plan, and more physically look at the options related to the crossing itself at Churchill. I suspect that, well, the issue both here and going forward on South Palo Alto will be Philip and Ripon and perhaps one other person are the entire team that are working on these efforts. And so it may come down to one, the bandwidth to do the work, and recognizing that whether it's best to organize it as a part of the grade separation work or as a part of the bike transportation planning work, but either way, to figure out how it fits with what have already been identified as critical path elements of both. So I just want to raise for awareness this issue of the capacity and question of how it would actually be tackled.
Well, that's a good point. So if we're in a situation where we have an apparent need to sequence this, and we have a rare set of opportunities for very significant capital dollars, but we lack internal capacity, then I think we need to put that on the table, and the council needs to understand what it would take to be able to break that logjam. And what I want to make sure is that we don't just not do it because current capacity can't do it. You say it's a problem. Here's what it would take to solve it. The council could decide, no, we're not going to do that. Or they could say, yes, we want to support it. And even in the context of the upcoming budget, if that's something that needs to be prioritized in this May budget, which I know staff is already working on, then we've got to, if we as a committee want to say, we recommend to the council that this be prioritized, staff has to hear that soon enough that they can fold that into the budget, at least as an alternative, if not a recommendation.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much, City Manager, for helping me to keep track of my thoughts there. The resources is a major constraint as we move forward. So I really want to recognize that, but I also want to note that we recognize that this is a strained resource. And so we actually are planning to include a request in the budget for someone to work on this. We just want to quickly note that I think Mountain View has like 5 staff working on grade separations. And that they have 2 crossings. So we're doing a lot with a little here. So we will be requesting additional resources to help us out with this. We think that we're going to have a lot of work done already from the BPTP, the community outreach, and we think we'll be in a good position to apply for funding for additional crossings in that next time frame.
That sounds great. And so within the Measure B dollars plus we've tapped into other bike and ped dollars and even other Measure B dollars that were not the grade separation dollars to date. And just so everybody understands that, in Measure B, we not only negotiated what is now over $400 million for Palo Alto's 4 grade separations. It was 350 initially, and it's now 420, or a year ago, 420 had grown to. But we had other negotiations for other buckets of dollars in there. And San Jose and others at that time in 2016 wanted to dedicate that to street and road repair because their pavement condition index, their road conditions were terrible. We had invested for 8-10 years in that, and we were highest in the region. And I was able to negotiate that we would have latitude on that, our share of that bucket, and we've tapped into it. So from a standpoint of funding our staffing needs, are those funds potentially available not just for consultant work and design work, but for our own internal costs? If we needed to staff up, can we tap into any of those funds for our purposes?
That is something we'll need to look into further. I'm not sure that it covers staff time. So that's something we will look into that. But also noting that if we added additional staffing for this, it wouldn't just be this for this alone. It would be for other things. You know, a key example of that was an item that was requested by Councilmember Tanaka for a bike and scooter share. That's another project which we don't have currently resources to work on.
Right. Although that's an example, something that we've had an interest in, but it was not something that was endorsed in the council motion. So as of right now, for this year, it's not a tentative priority, even something that's coming back. I think it is a future one, but that is an example, but it's an example of a differentiation that council has already made. It wasn't even referred to come back, so it's off the table for this year. Okay, so it's hard to unravel this Gordian knot of how these things all intersect with one another and how that influences sequencing and all of this. But for me, what I would want to propose is that we look at how we bring forward to this committee sooner rather than later a recommendation to the council on sequencing of bike and ped crossings, separated bike and ped crossings, with the prospect of the one in the vicinity of Loma Verde being the most unconstrained and highest priority. So unconstrained in that it's not dependent on what decisions we make on the vehicular crossing at Meadow or Charleston. It's a higher priority. We believed in Seal. We have this, and we haven't talked about it, but we have an upgrade at Churchill on the existing at-grade crossing that is supposed to start construction already in this year. Is that correct? On the whole Churchill improvements on bike thoroughfare there.
Oh, yes. Sorry. You're asking about the Churchill Avenue Enhanced Bikeways project?
Yes.
And sorry, your question was?
Well, that's already
moving forward.
It's moving forward.
Yes.
And so even though that doesn't answer the question of what our ultimate grade separated crossing would be there, it is a significant improvement that is already in the CIP, right? So that's why, for multiple reasons, the one in the vicinity of Loma Verde is the one we could move on and seek these big construction dollars as soon as we've got a design alternative. I'm pretty convinced that we could get funding for that and get that done and have real progress on that first leg that helps us then move forward on the vehicular crossings and everything else. And it just doesn't have the obstacles that all the others presently have. That's why I'm pushing it first. And then hopefully we will soon refine the Meadow and Charleston alternatives so that we would then know whether we're dealing with a dedicated crossing or an integrated crossing for bikes and peds. But we don't know that yet. And that's why I keep saying, okay, how can we have real tapping into construction dollars and do a construction sooner rather than later that will have real impacts on the community. And I think that's the one that stands out. It needs to come first, and probably needs to come first, and it's discrete. It's not dependent on some other item on a critical path, and that's why I keep pushing this. And it has a well-developed history of established that we need an east-west route in that approximate location. Now we haven't decided on the location. That would be part of the decision making once we say we want to prioritize that and refine. We'd have to figure out, okay, where do we put it exactly? And that's not simple, but that is focused and something we can accomplish and something that I'm convinced we could get funding for lickety split. It's my pitch. Okay, that was a lot on that, but
Sounds like you got your
Yeah,
checkbook ready.
I got somebody else's checkbook in mind. It's not yours, don't worry. Okay, that was a lot on that, but you know, it's what do we move on first, and what are our sequences, and all these things are tied together. So let's see, we've gone through a lot of this now on the tentative plan. As Philip mentioned, the San Francisco Creek Bridge replacement, we're pushing Caltrain to come back to us on the option of repair rather than replacement for the bridge. I've raised issues with them on what they've allowed of the degradation of that bridge over a multiple decade period. So I've sent them photographs of rust, massive rust.
I have to quickly note that I think that our in-person meeting with them was due to those photographs.
Oh, good, good. They're not copyrighted. Okay. And then, so then we've got, we have this item, updates on funding and legislative information and opportunities for grade separations. So let's just touch on that a little bit. My understanding is that really we have certain funding to help us with furthering the selection and design, preliminary design, which are the prerequisites to tap into the big dollars. Is that correct? That can you tell us what this? Let's break that item, which is the sixth one on your tentative schedule. Break it down between maybe three parts to that question. Maybe that's what we do even when we talk about the agenda. One is the funding for to proceed on the selection of preferred alternative, and then the preliminary design, which are the two steps that are needed to qualify us for the construction dollars. And then the third part of that is, well, then the construction dollar funding pursuit, where that might be. And lastly, legislative aspects, which are different from pursuing funding from existing buckets. So can you speak a little bit to where we stand on available dollars for proceeding on design alternatives, and then dollars for preliminary design, the things that need to be teed up to qualify for the big construction dollars?
Thank you. Okay, so let me try my best here, and Ripon might have to jump in, but so we have Measure B grade separation dollars, which we've received permission from VTA to utilize, or I guess really not permission is not the right word, but their agreement with us that we can use that funding to pursue our additional studies that we believe are part of this, I guess, as you would call it, conceptual design phase, in order to help us complete our selection. So we've got that funding. As you referenced earlier, we also have the Measure B local streets and roads, because our pavement condition index is high enough that we can use that funding for congestion relieving activities. So that's a question I'll have to come back to about the staffing. Really what this issue is, or this item is intended to encapsulate, is a whole bunch of unknowns, but I'll just list some of them. They're grant funds that we're applying for on an ongoing basis. We've applied for MEGA, which is a grant program, federal grant program, Infra, which is also a federal grant program. As I mentioned earlier in the update today, we've applied for Infra, TIRCP. Sorry, I said Infra already. just 5 days ago. That application was due. That's the primary thing here, but this is kind of a catch-all for anything else that might come up in relation to any other funding opportunities that arise. Another one, what is it? The Section 130 funds, 190 funds, the FRA 190 funds. So any of those other funding sources that may come into play. You referenced earlier preliminary design, that phase actually. It could be that we apply for funding only for that phase or for multiple phases, even through construction. But some of what we believe will make us more competitive is getting to a selected alternative for all of our locations. Right now, we need to prioritize, or often when we apply for these grants, we need to prioritize. And it, I believe, makes us less competitive if we don't have a selected alternative.
And you said for all of them, but really, we're not likely to get construction dollars at once for that would cover all three. And so maybe I'd suggest that getting to one of them with a preferred alternative and preliminary design moves us up in the queue for that one, whichever that may be. And so that goes back to, just like with the bike and ped one, we need to tee up our first in sequence, which hopefully is also our highest priority, so that we get eligible we get in line as soon as possible. And I don't know which that'll be. It's tied in with these other issues, but we'll have to see what emerges.
I'm trying to think back in my memory, but I believe that council had prioritized Charleston, Meadow Charleston in that order. So that's following that. That's how we are applying currently.
Thank you for that clarification, and I fully agree with doing prioritizing that. And where we stand right now is we're probably further along at narrowing our alternatives for Churchill, but our higher priority is Charleston East Meadow. And that's where I was referring to trying to align our priorities with our sequencing. So that really further reiterates to us as a group, how do we have the focus on that? Just like earlier in this conversation, we said, well, part of this is, can we remove the reconsideration of the trench if we just don't have an option due to needing to have a 4-track placeholder? And should we bring back and let council decide whether they want to reevaluate a viaduct, not all of South Palo Alto, but just for those 2 crossings? And I don't know the answer to that. Nadia, you had something?
I was just going to point out, first, exactly what you were saying is that our priority, the council's direction was Meadow Charleston, but we seem to be moving faster on Churchill. But I do want to recognize, I had spoken to Ripon before the meeting about the fact that this plan doesn't at all talk about when do we start looking at alternatives for Palo Alto Avenue. And I recognize that this is just a year and a half out, and that is probably more of a delayed conversation. But I do worry about, we're pushing back on Caltrain that the replacement of the San Francisco Creek Bridge should be a rehabilitation and not a full replacement. And I recognize that you are now on the board of Caltrain, so that hopefully provides us a little bit of more illumination into what's happening on the inside of Caltrain. But there's always the chance that because it's a safety issue, that they just decide, hey, that bridge needs to be replaced. We've decided it needs to be replaced. If Palo Alto wants to spend money to argue with us, fine, but otherwise we're going to change it. And what that does is that it puts our options for Palo Alto Avenue in jeopardy. So I wanted to highlight the fact that I understand and appreciate that we have a big staffing challenge and that poor Ripon and Philip are juggling more things than the Cirque du Soleil people at this point. But we really should not drop the ball on what happens around Palo Alto Avenue. And this is part of the Gordian knot that relates to Stanford, because of course they own the station area. And so while you think about your response about the community plan that Stanford has and what's going on with the now deceased GUP, but whatever the new iteration of that is, we kind of have to have that conversation in tandem. And so I know that there's been some consideration of having an ad hoc committee for Stanford. I want to make sure that this is part of that conversation, because you may be forced to deal with Palo Alto Avenue ahead of all of them, and then we're going to be caught completely flat-footed.
So let me touch on that. So first, we have an ad hoc committee. And that I think maybe what we should add to our list is a kind of placeholder, lower priority, lower sequence, but around the three parts of this, the Creek Bridge replacement, Palo Alto Avenue, and the intermodal station. Big projects, hopefully not as immediate as the others, but a reason to even include them within this year's work plan, lower priority than these more pressing issues, includes at the role of the intermodal station and how outdated it is, and that it's not only the highest boardings in the Caltrain system at the moment, but as of a number of years ago, it had this shocking number of 900 buses that were loaded per day there. Just it's a quiz test to ask anybody to take a guess, and we'll all lowball it by 2/3 at best. And connected with that is a question of, in the 2000 Measure A for VTA funding, was a lot of money dedicated toward Dumbarton Rail Crossing, and secondarily toward, and this is the one that is often forgotten, the Palo Alto Intermodal Center. Those dollars both got transferred to BART, which was a big part of why we negotiated so hard on Measure B to make sure that couldn't happen again. And that's been largely successful. Nevertheless, this has been recognized for decades as a major critical part of county transportation and Caltrain, and the VTA had funding, and there's a question of whether there are still Measure A dollars that have been undetermined in their allocation that we could tap into, or other funding sources. I mean, we've looked at MTC, and VTA has talked about helping us there. And now, more recently, in the Caltrain discussion, at our last board meeting, we had a action item on the negotiation guiding principles for Caltrain negotiating with the Joint Power Authority for what's been called the DTX terminal to date. They're renaming it, hopefully not an acronym. The portal.
It's called the portal.
The portal. But the downtown intermodal station. And that's racing forward because it potentially has massive federal dollars in funding and huge political support from very powerful federal and state officials with an interest in that. Caltrain board, at my recommendation, modified the guiding principles to place that our position as Caltrain on that issue, to put it our negotiation in context with Caltrain's 2040 master plan, which we specifically discussed that is not more important than grade separations nor other station improvements, which Caltrain was focusing on the Dearborn Station and Redwood City. And I reminded the board of the history of the Palo Alto Intermodal Station and its massive current use compared to the others. We do anticipate that Dearborn and Redwood City will have very significant growth and greater growth than Palo Alto Station, but Palo Alto Station right now is far and away a greater user. So that all goes into what Nadia was talking about of we need to make sure that we are bearing in mind both that's on our future list, and that having preliminary involvement with it may tee up funding that we need to be discussing with these agencies now, even if we aren't ready to move on this as a project because we have so much else on our plate. So how that all fits in, we don't know. But I think it's important that it not be off our list, that we recognize it's not our most immediate priority, but it is there and of high importance, and we don't want to let huge funding opportunities go by the wayside because we aren't even looking at them.
Thank you. Just really quickly to explain kind of our internal priority, and let us know if we're thinking about this incorrectly, but our internal strategy was to get one of the other locations into the next phase so that Ripon has the capacity to take on Palo Alto Avenue. But certainly your point is well taken about adding it to the list, and maybe as like a, I guess placeholder or
strategizing.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's the way. What we're really talking about is let's get it on the list for strategizing as opposed to a bunch of staff resources or otherwise. And I agree with you that I think we're all in agreement that we're not talking about throwing it into the same sequence or priority as the other things, but keeping our eye on the future ball.
I just wanted to flag for you, Councilmember Burt, the same way Ripon and Philip are doing a great job of kind of looking for any grant opportunities that come up. There's a team of Ripon and Philip equivalents on the Caltrain side who's basically taking every opportunity that they can to get replacement money, and that bridge qualifies under the state of good repair stuff because it's really old. And just because of the political situation, that may pop up potentially really unexpectedly, and they may make an aggressive move because it's high on their list. And so I mean, not that you're not already aware, but it's complicated because one of the alternatives for Palo Alto Avenue relates not just to the bridge, but if you have something elevated, that also goes into Menlo Park, which crosses county lines, which now crosses funding lines because San Mateo County is on a different funding program. They don't have Measure B. They're not as well positioned as some of the other San Mateo cities to move on some of those things. And so I'm worried that we're going to be in a position, and there's nothing we could really do other than babysit it, but we could be in a position where they end up replacing that bridge and we don't have a say in it. And then we are still stuck about talking about either moving that bridge over or whatnot. The only thing that saves us in being able to have a real impact on that is the conversation about the El Palo Alto tree. And if we can prove that we can't mess with the existing bridge and we have to move it over, then that fosters new conversation, but also, of
That's
course,
right. That was your earlier point on why we want to have that El Palo Alto tree report come forward, because it strengthens our hand.
Yeah, we've been really, really closely working with the people working on that report. So Caltrain is aware that we are working on that, and that they're awaiting that from us. So we are closely monitoring that. I also want to mention you're absolutely right about the state of good repair money. And we think that's what they will use. But I also want to point out that the word repair is in the title of that funding. So we're kind of hoping that doesn't have to mean replace. So just noting that.
Very, very good.
Can I just ask, what's the legality of hanging onto that tree and them just saying, it's in the way, too bad?
I think that's a really, really messy proposition, because it's a national historic what is it? Yeah, I don't remember the title, but it's a historic
resource, right?
Yeah, number 2 in the state, I believe. So it would be very difficult for them. So I think they are going to need to consider that.
Although that is one of the things that we may want to look at in that context, is whether it has the adequate designation to strengthen what we believe should be the position. On one list of California historic landmarks, it's listed as number 2, but I had assumed it had other greater designations, and I'm not an expert on this, but this is something that we may want to pursue as well, and that could be part of that strategic approach. So anyway, all this, I think that's my long list of questions and input on this. And so does anybody, Vice or Mayor Koo?
Oh, just quickly, in that same category of receive updates on funding and legislative information, what kind of legislative information are you expecting or have we had?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're expecting any. I just wanted to kind of put a catch-all in case there is something that comes out. But it's most likely to relate to funding.
Okay, and then in regards to funding, so you're working with a lot of grants and so forth and Measure B and potentially if you find the bucket of Measure A money. But is there any reason to be lobbying in when we go to our NLC, the National League of Cities, to lobby for funding over there?
I guess I'm not exactly sure about the National League of Cities. I'm not sure if City Manager Shikata has a thought about that. But
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, actually, the same really. I don't know that there's a direct connection given that the funding is typically run through a program and that the NLC wouldn't necessarily be the route through which that information would pass.
Well, in the past, I still remember that we would visit all the legislators, the Congress folks, as well as go to some of the departments like DOT, whichever ones that potentially we can sit down and talk to about needing the dollars for our grade separation.
Gotcha. Which is separate from NLC. Maybe the NLC is the reason you're in town, but those meetings really being separate.
Yeah,
And that's a differentiation between legislative advocacy versus through agencies that already basically have through legislation this really unprecedented funding that we're talking about. So we can talk more on that, but they're with the agencies, that is potentially the case to at least make sure they know where we are in our process and understand how high our grade separations are on the safety hazard ranking, which is very important, as well as this broader issue that is along with Caltrain, and we discuss this and our state legislators are starting to really argue it this way, but it's been a Caltrain discussion of the Caltrain corridor and the need to grade separate it. Why is that such a high priority? When we look at the state budget and the incredible surpluses that we've had the last 2 years, those have been predominantly driven by the economic engine that is served by the Caltrain line. The entire state budget and frankly, a real impact on the US economy resides in this corridor. And in discussion with some of our legislators, it was kind of a argument that, well, they really owe it to us to fund these things because this corridor is feeding the state budget. My argument was, I don't think that's going to be compelling to legislators in Sacramento. What's more compelling is they want to feed the vitality of this region in their own self-interest because it is providing those dollars for things that they care about elsewhere in the state. And it is in their interest to support our needs as opposed to their moral obligation to do so. And so I think that that's an argument that we will want to carry forward at the state and the federal level, and frankly, regionally with MTC, is that it's in their interest to prioritize this, not that they owe it to us, even though they do. All right. This has seemed like a long conversation. I apologize for dominating it so much, but I with some of the new members and otherwise, there's a lot of context. And let me just turn to Philip or Ed and colleagues, any thoughts on wrap up? What have we answered the questions well enough on kind of helping refine the year's agenda? I'm sure you now need to kind of come back and refine what you had already put down here. And as chair, I can, sit down with you on that aspect. But any other things that we should cover?
Actually, I wanted to add, I don't see jackboxing in here. Is that still something that we should be looking into?
Yeah, so that's folded in where with this, the technical standards, and that's a construction method part of technical standards. Yeah, it's and that's I would add equally important to that under construction methods is, for instance, bridge decks, where refining like Mountain View did in the thickness of a bridge deck, we found out that like we had a proposal when we were looking at the Churchill intersection, and that AECOM had, or maybe it wasn't them, but in Mountain View, they had a refinement on the Rengstorff that if something similar were applied to Churchill, it opens up and means we don't have a center pillar. The whole design gets better. So there are a couple of construction method elements that are not necessarily design standards. They kind of intersect.
So it would fit under the Receive Caltrain Corridor CCS study within that framework?
Yes, some of it would, but just also noting that Caltrain did commit to us that they would be willing to come and provide information about alternative construction techniques. So that is something that we plan to hold them to as well.
Okay,
very good.
And it also fits into the fourth row of the tentative schedule, which is the service agreement. Would we have them review what we want as kind of one-offs versus what you were describing under the one on this corridor crossing strategy? And then a third sounds like it might be outside of either of those that they had volunteered to come forward. So kind of three buckets. They are all related to how do we get a refinement in what they will let us do that allows us to construct these things that are better designs and or at lower cost, or lower impacts on the community from construction time frame, all those things. So that's the bucket, and several different paths that we can take to getting to that end point.
Can we have them come? It'd be really great to get a Caltrain given presentation on jack box construction prior to you guys as a council deciding whether or not you want to keep the trench or put on a viaduct or talk about the hybrid. I mean, if they've got information that they could give us, it would be interesting to sort of hear them and in some ways let them sell their services. If you
Well, maybe that begs on next upcoming agendas. What would we like VTA or Caltrain, Caltrain or perhaps VTA, I should say in that order, to present on? And we know that when we get them here to present, we get their attention. They move more on our priorities than if we're trading emails or even sidebar meetings. So any thoughts on what we should be looking for Caltrain to come back and report out and or provide presentations on in the next one or two meetings?
Yeah, well, I think some of that does tie to that fourth item that you had referenced, the standard agreement. But the one thing that Caltrain had committed to doing was talk about alternative construction methods. I think that's something that they can talk about outside of either the study or the service agreement. I think that they were willing to talk about that. And so I do think that's something that maybe we can, as long as the dates work, we can get them to come to one of our upcoming meetings.
Well, since we're trying to hold our feet and their feet to the fire, why don't we see whether even the March meeting, we could piecemeal that, and all the better if we don't ask them to do too many things in a single meeting, but we have them in a series of meetings on different subtopics.
they had very specifically said that they gave a presentation to the city of Mountain View about jacked box construction. So hopefully this isn't something that, this is something they can just repeat, not new material.
Sounds good. Ed,
Yeah, I just want to comment that understanding the priorities for the four and that Churchill is not one of the priorities. It is one of the projects. So we basically have four projects.
I'm sorry. So did you mean Churchill or Palo Alto Avenue is not?
No, I meant that Churchill is not as high a priority as
Right. It
Meadow.
is a priority, just
Yeah.
not quite as.
Yeah, they're all priorities. This is just when you were talking about staging and phasing. If we're lucky enough to get the answers that says, hey, this the proposal that we're checking out right now, if the partial underpass works, then I think we should do it. Move forward on it, because we don't want to, as much as I love priorities, we won't say, well, yeah, but it's not our highest priority. So let's wait till we get the, trenching figured out further down the tracks, because that would give us action, which talks to people about funding us and shows us that we're active, and also shows the citizens that we're active, but based on data. When we finally got the data, we could make a decision, and now we're going to go for it. So I hope that doesn't sound like I'm talking about both sides of my mouth. I'm just saying, if we get the data on Churchill and it's, we can go ahead with this, then I think we should do that, even though we'd rather go first on Meadow.
Well, I think that raises the valid question, and why I was really repeatedly talking about prioritization independent of sequencing. And I don't think that that's something we would want to decide at this point in time, but there may be a crunch point at which that becomes a decision. But I wouldn't at this point in time support that sort of decision just because Churchill appears to be further along in its alternative selection.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Okay, great.
I also wanted to clarify, it's technically 3 projects because Meadow and Charleston are considered one project together, and they have to be done together, which actually qualifies us as a mega project, which has a different funding category than necessarily a regular grade separation, and kind of makes us special in the world of funding, if I understand.
Yeah, that's correct. And just noting that we actually consider it a mega project anyways, because we're talking about 3 grade separations, which we've been applying for, right?
Okay. And anything else from staff as wrap up?
Yes, I just want to say I've got 2 items that I see for the next meeting, which is the rail committee to review selection criteria at the March meeting. And we'll see if we can get Caltrain, if it works at the March meeting, to talk about alternative construction techniques and specifically jackboxing. But I just want to kind of confirm the rest of the list of items. I'm not sure, actually. I'm going to look a little bit at our attorney here to find out, do we need some sort of action for the list of items?
It's really, I think this is an agendizing sort of thing. Yeah.
I mean, it's up to the chair if you want to do formal motion about making changes, or if Philip feels like he and Ripon know, they've listened to the conversation, they know what everyone said. It didn't sound like there was too much question about what the topics are and what goes where.
Yeah, I think between Philip and myself, and we work together on taking the input here and working out the agenda plan, and then we'll have an opportunity as a committee to review the revised plan. And if we didn't get it right, and you'll set us right.
Yeah, and just thinking about a little bit more, it's not like if you make a motion to change this, you can even stick to it, right? I mean, there are things that will be out of your control. There are things that you might want to change anyway. So I think it's enough that, Philip and Ripon have heard what the committee has had to say.
There's the video.
No, thank you.
So this is a working work plan that will have
That's right.
changes.
As
And
all of our committees really are,
yep. And also, as you mentioned, there's a lot of dependencies between these different items. So
a lot. Yeah.
I was going to give a hint for staff. In XCAP's report, there's actually a section on suggestions for the updates to the criteria. So part of what we referenced in our report was the fact that we had conflicting criteria because we had the 2013 Palo Alto rail report, which basically talks about trying to make more east-west crossings. And then we had other documents that pointed to other things. So you might want to look there when you guys are thinking about your staff report to kind of raise how we do have several policy documents that seem to contradict each other when we're thinking about these priorities. So we make sure we kind of catch everything. And I'm thinking specifically of the comp plan has things that are not necessarily the same as what was in the criteria and not necessarily the same as what's in that Palo Alto rail report for, I think it's 2012 or I forget what, 2013 maybe. It's in the XCAP report.
And I'm just out as looking forward to both kind of our most immediate, the March and April meetings, and focus on the March. So we've got on March, the selection criteria, and then the Caltrain construction methods. Was that it?
Yeah, and then just to mention something else that we would be doing in tandem. Well, a lot of these things we'll be doing in tandem, but one of the other things that we heard is we'll hold on doing the cost peer review on the trench alternative,
Pending referring to council for an affirmation of that. So it's a temporary hold until we can get back to council.
Yep.
And I guess as I'm trying to think about what else in March? Yeah, city manager.
Actually, you raise an important point as to whether and how to keep the full council aware of this conversation. It might be something you could even report out verbally at the next council meeting, if not more formally.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about how we might summarize this freewheeling conversation, but it does connected with that, and maybe we. Whether it's the March meeting or April, Philip and I can kind of brainstorm on this, is do we identify which are the most immediate things we need to take back to the council for affirmation in order to make sure that we have their authority to proceed in the way that we think is our revised plan. And so maybe we want to have that discussion in March, whether we resolve it or not, put it on the agenda for prospective referrals to council. And so that we'll be able to digest this discussion and be thinking about outside the meeting what things we need to ask their consent on. All good? I think that rings the bell 20 minutes early, despite feeling like a very long meeting, at least a full meeting. So unless anybody has anything else, our meeting is adjourned. Oh, I should refine just so everybody knows, the date of our next meeting is scheduled for March 15th. Sounds great. Same time, same place. All right. Thank you.